The rain poured relentlessly, drumming against the pavement as Jamal rushed home from his late-night shift. His hoodie was soaked through, his sneakers squelching with every hurried step. The cold bit into his skin, but he barely noticed. His mind was on the hunger gnawing at his stomach. He had skipped dinner again, just to save a little more money for home. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw her. Standing beneath a flickering streetlight, a woman, drenched, trembling, and completely out of place. Her designer dress clung to her frame, her makeup streaked down her face, and her arms were wrapped around herself in a silent attempt to hold in her fear. Her eyes darted around the deserted street, then over her shoulder. Was she being followed? Jamal hesitated. He knew how this looked. A young black teen approaching a wealthy-looking woman in the middle of the night. That was a recipe for disaster. But then he saw her legs shake, her lips moving in hushed prayers, and in that moment, his instincts overpowered his caution. "Ma'am, are you okay?" he asked, stepping closer. She flinched at his voice, her breath catching in her throat. Her wide, tear-filled eyes met his, and for a second she looked like she might run. But something in his face, in the genuine concern in his voice, made her pause. I don't know where I am," she whispered. I think someone was following me." Jamal's stomach twisted. He glanced around, scanning the dark alleyways and parked cars for movement. Nothing. But he wasn't about to leave her out here alone. "Come on," he said gently. "There's a diner a few blocks away. It's warm, and you can figure things out there." She hesitated, then nodded, pulling her drenched coat tighter around herself. Jamal walked slightly ahead, giving her space, making sure she felt safe. The rain kept falling, but for the first time that night, he wasn't thinking about the cold. By morning, the entire incident had faded into the back of his mind. Life moved on. Bills still needed paying, school was still exhausting, and work still drained every ounce of energy he had. So when a sleek black limousine pulled up in front of his rundown apartment complex, Jamal thought he was imagining things. The entire street seemed to pause. His neighbors peeked through their windows. Kids stopped playing. Even his mother, weary from her overnight shift, stepped onto the porch in confusion. Then the back door of the limo opened, and out stepped the woman from last night. Only this time, she wasn't drenched, terrified, or lost. She was poised, radiant, and exuding an air of quiet authority. Jamal's heart pounded as she smiled at him, then turned to the driver. "Bring it out." A second man stepped out, holding a briefcase. He walked toward Jamal, stopping right in front of him before opening it. Inside was a scholarship letter, a full ride. "For you," the woman said, her voice steady, grateful. "I know what it's like to be underestimated, to be ignored, but last night you didn't ignore me. You helped me when I had no one, and now I want to return the favor." Jamal's knees felt weak. His mother covered her mouth in shock. This wasn't just a thank you. This was life-changing. Jamal's breath came out in clouds, merging with the steam rising from the rain-soaked pavement. The streetlights above flickered weakly, their dim glow barely cutting through the darkness. The storm had emptied the streets, leaving behind nothing but the sound of distant thunder and the rhythmic splatter of rain against the asphalt. "Ma'am, are you okay?" His voice carried over the downpour, cautious but firm, his eyes scanning the area for any sign of danger. The woman flinched at his voice, her whole body tensing. She turned to face him, her wide, frightened eyes locking onto his. For a brief moment, she looked ready to run. But then, as if realizing he wasn't a threat, her breath hitched and she clutched her arms around herself tighter. I don't know where I am," she whispered, barely audible over the storm. Her hands fumbled for her phone, but when she pressed the screen, nothing happened. Dead. Jamal frowned. His instincts screamed that something wasn't right. His eyes flickered over her, taking in the small details that told a bigger story. Her shoes, expensive, the kind of heels that belonged at a gala or a five-star restaurant, were caked in mud. Her dress, luxurious fabric, now damp and torn at the hem. Her wrist, a fresh bruise forming, dark against her pale skin, like someone had grabbed her too tightly. And the way she kept glancing over her shoulder, as if expecting someone to appear from the shadows, told him that she wasn't just lost. She was running. Jamal hesitated for a second, then pulled his hoodie over his head and, without hesitation, handed it to her. "You're freezing. Here." She stared at the hoodie like it was a foreign object. Then her eyes lifted to his face, searching. "Why are you helping me?" Jamal shrugged. "Because you need it." Her lips parted slightly as if she wanted to say something else. But instead, she took the hoodie, pulling it over her shoulders. It hung loosely over her delicate frame, swallowing her almost completely. Jamal barely registered the rain soaking through his t-shirt now. "You lost?" he asked. She nodded but didn't elaborate. No name, no explanation, no mention of where she came from or how she ended up here. Jamal exhaled slowly, his breath mixing with the storm. This woman, who clearly belonged somewhere far from here, was standing alone in the worst part of town, dressed like she'd just left a black tie event. Something about it made his stomach tighten. The street lamp beside them flickered again, sending erratic shadows stretching across the wet pavement. Jamal glanced around. The streets were eerily empty. No cabs. The buses had stopped running an hour ago. No nearby buildings where she could take shelter. If he left her here, she'd be completely alone. He could just walk away. It wasn't his problem, but something inside him wouldn't let him. "Come on," he said finally. "There's a diner a few blocks away. It's warm, and you can wait there until you figure things out." The woman hesitated again, chewing on her lip. Then, as if making a decision, she nodded. Jamal turned, leading the way. He walked slightly ahead, giving her space, letting her feel in control. His own home was just a few blocks in the opposite direction, but he ignored the pull to go there. His stomach growled in protest, reminding him he hadn't eaten. But right now, none of that mattered. The rain pounded harder, the wind howled between the buildings, and behind them, just beyond the edge of the flickering light, something moved in the darkness. Jamal's fingers trembled slightly as he stepped into the dimly lit convenience store. The overhead fluorescent lights buzzed softly, casting a cold glow over the aisles of snacks and half-stocked shelves. The clerk behind the counter, a weary-looking man with graying hair, glanced up from his newspaper with mild disinterest. "Hey, you got a phone I can borrow?" Jamal asked, his voice steady despite the chill seeping into his bones. The clerk raised an eyebrow, giving him a once-over before sighing and reaching under the counter. "Make it quick." Jamal took the old, slightly greasy phone and quickly dialed a cab service, rattling off the address of the nearest intersection. "Yeah, it's urgent," he added, his eyes flicking toward the glass doors where the woman stood, hugging his hoodie around her trembling frame. When he handed the phone back, the clerk looked past him, narrowing his eyes at the woman. "She in trouble?" Jamal hesitated before answering. "Dunno, just trying to help." The clerk grunted, shaking his head as he went back to his newspaper. "People don't do that much these days." Jamal ignored the comment and stepped back outside, the cold immediately sinking into his skin without his hoodie. The rain had softened into a steady drizzle, the neon glow of the streetlights reflecting off the wet pavement. The woman glanced at him as he approached, her eyes flickering with something he couldn't quite place. Gratitude, maybe, or disbelief. "You don't have to do this," she whispered, her voice nearly lost in the sound of distant thunder. Jamal huffed out a small, tired smile. "Yeah, well, can't leave you here, can I?" She looked like she wanted to argue, but the cab's headlights cut through the night, pulling both of their attention toward the approaching vehicle. The tires splashed through puddles as the driver pulled up beside them. Jamal reached into his pocket and pulled out the last $10 bill he had. His breakfast money. He'd planned to buy something warm before school in the morning, maybe even splurge on a coffee. But he didn't hesitate. He stepped toward the cab, leaning in through the open passenger window. "Hey, take her wherever she needs to go. This should cover it." The driver, a burly man with tired eyes, gave him a long look before nodding. "You got it, kid." Jamal turned back to the woman, nodding toward the open door. She hesitated for just a second, then stepped inside. The dim interior light illuminated her face, and for the first time, he noticed just how exhausted she looked. Whatever had happened before he found her, it had drained her completely. She turned to him just as the driver shifted into gear, her expression unreadable. "The world needs more people like you," she murmured. Jamal barely had time to process the words before the window slid up and the taxi pulled away, its red taillights disappearing into the night. For a long moment he just stood there, rain running down his face, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. Then, with a quiet sigh, he turned and started the long walk home, convinced he would never see her again. But fate had other plans. Jamal groaned as his little sister, Maya, bounced on his bed with all the energy of a child who had just been fed pure sugar. "Jamal! Jamal, wake up!" she shrieked, shaking him by the shoulders. He swatted blindly at her, groggy and confused. "Maya, what? There's a limo outside!" she practically screamed, bouncing so hard the old mattress groaned under them. Jamal's sleep-fogged brain stalled. "What?" He shoved the blankets off and staggered toward the window, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. He blinked, then blinked again. There, parked right in front of their crumbling apartment complex, was the sleekest, blackest limousine he had ever seen. The entire street was buzzing. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains. Kids abandoned their games to gawk. Even old man Harris, who never left his porch, was leaning forward in his rocking chair, squinting in curiosity. Jamal's stomach twisted. What the hell was happening? A man in a crisp black suit stepped out of the limo, moving with the kind of precision that made it clear he wasn't just some driver. He strode toward their front door with purpose, his polished shoes barely making a sound against the cracked pavement. Jamal barely had time to register the sight before his mother's voice rang through the house. "Jamal!" she called, her voice sharp with confusion. He ran downstairs just as she opened the door, staring warily at the suited man standing on their worn-out porch. "Can I help you?" she asked, her hand tightening around the doorknob. The man smiled, polite but unreadable. "I'm looking for Jamal Carter." Jamal's heart pounded. His mother turned to him, eyes flickering with a dozen silent questions. Slowly, he stepped forward. "That's me." The man nodded, then gestured toward the limo. "Miss Kensington would like a word." Jamal frowned. "Who?" Then, the limo door swung open, and out stepped her. Except this time she wasn't drenched in rain, trembling in the cold. She wasn't lost. She looked powerful. Her long, sleek coat was draped over her shoulders like a queen's cloak, and her heels clicked sharply against the pavement as she approached. The sun gleamed off the gold bracelets on her wrist, the very same wrist that had been bruised the night before. Jamal barely recognized her. His mother sucked in a breath. "Who?" But before she could finish, the woman smiled. "Jamal," she said warmly. "It's good to see you again." Jamal swallowed. Yeah, you too." She turned to his mother, her expression softening. "I'm sorry for the intrusion. I just had to personally thank your son for what he did last night." His mother's brow furrowed. "Last night?" The woman looked back at Jamal. "He saved me." A murmur rippled through the gathered neighbors. Jamal shifted, uncomfortable under the attention. "I just called a cab," he muttered. The woman's smile widened. No, Jamal, you did more than that. You helped me when I was at my most vulnerable. And I'm someone who isn't used to needing help. His mother's gaze darted between them, clearly trying to piece things together. I'm sorry, but who exactly are you? The woman extended her hand. Victoria Kensington. His mother froze. So did Jamal. That name wasn't just familiar. It was famous. Victoria Kensington, Chief Executive Officer of Kensington Enterprises, one of the richest women in the country. His mother's mouth opened and closed. You're... Victoria smiled. Yes. Jamal felt like he had stepped into another reality. Victoria turned back to him, and suddenly, the suited man was beside her, holding out a leather folder. I came here today because I wanted to give you this, she said. Jamal hesitated before taking the folder. He flipped it open, his brain barely able to process what he was looking at. A scholarship, a full ride. His breath caught. I read up on you, Jamal, Victoria said gently. Straight A student, works nights to help support his family, dreams of going to college but worried about the cost. She nodded toward the folder. That? That covers everything. Tuition, housing, books, even living expenses. All paid for. Jamal couldn't move, couldn't speak. His mother's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes glistening. Victoria's voice softened. You gave me your last $10 last night. A stranger, no expectations, no hesitation. She gestured toward the folder. Consider this my way of paying it forward. Jamal's hands tightened around the papers. This wasn't just a thank you. This was life-changing, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like the world had finally seen him. Jamal's head was spinning. Lillian Crawford? He repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. The name rang in his ears like an explosion. She wasn't just any woman. She was Lillian Crawford, the CEO of Crawford Enterprises, one of the most powerful businesswomen in the entire country. His breath hitched as she continued speaking, her voice calm, yet laced with the weight of the past 24 hours. Last night, I was at a gala, she explained, stepping forward. It was a business event, a high-profile one. I was supposed to finalize a major partnership deal. Everything seemed fine until I found out that my business partners were trying to manipulate me into signing a fraudulent contract. Jamal's stomach clenched. I refused, Lillian continued, her eyes darkening. And when I did, they weren't happy. They made threats, veiled ones, but threats nonetheless. They warned me that if I walked away, I'd regret it, that rejecting the deal would come with consequences. Jamal's fists tightened. I panicked, she admitted, her voice softer now. I knew I had to get out before things escalated. So, I slipped out through the back exit before they could stop me, but I had no time to grab my phone or purse. I just ran. She let out a breath, as if reliving the moment. I thought I could make it to my driver, but with the storm, everything became chaotic. My driver never made it to the pickup point. The rain made it impossible to see anything. I ended up lost in a part of the city I'd never been to before. She shook her head, a wry smile tugging at the corners of her lips. And out of everyone who saw me, out of every single person I passed, not one of them stopped. Jamal swallowed hard. Except you, she said, her eyes locking onto his. His pulse thundered in his ears. You didn't ask for my name. You didn't ask why I was there. You just helped me, Lillian continued. You gave me your hoodie, called me a cab, and used the last of your own money to make sure I got home safe. Jamal felt his mother's eyes on him, felt the way his little sister clung to his side, watching in awe. The entire neighborhood had gone silent, listening. Lillian took another step forward. People like you, Jamal? They're rare. Most people only help when there's something in it for them. But you helped because it was the right thing to do. And that means everything. Jamal's throat tightened. He had never been the type to expect anything in return for kindness. Life had taught him that expecting rewards only led to disappointment. But now, standing in front of one of the most powerful women in the country, watching as she spoke about him as if he were someone that mattered, it was overwhelming. "That's why I'm here," Lillian continued, "because I refuse to let a good deed go unnoticed. You changed my life last night, Jamal. And now, I want to change yours." She gestured toward the man beside her, who stepped forward and handed Jamal another folder. Curious and slightly trembling, Jamal opened it, and his breath hitched. It wasn't just a scholarship, it was a future, full tuition, a guaranteed internship at Crawford Enterprises, a personal mentorship under Lillian Crawford herself. Jamal felt the world tilt. Lillian smiled. "This is just the beginning, Jamal. You gave me your last $10. Now, I'm giving you something worth much more." Jamal's eyes burned with emotion. He clutched the papers in his hands, his chest rising and falling unevenly. For the first time in his life, he felt seen, and for the first time in a long time. He allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, his kindness had changed his own destiny. Jamal's fingers trembled as he took the thick envelope from Lillian's hands. It felt heavy, like it carried more than just papers, like it carried a future. The neighborhood was silent, the weight of the moment pressing against the air. His mother stood frozen beside him, her hands clutched tightly together, barely breathing as she watched. His little sister, still clinging to his leg, looked up at him with wide, hopeful eyes. Slowly, hesitantly, Jamal peeled back the flap and pulled out the documents inside. His eyes flicked over the first page, reading the bold letters at the top. Full college scholarship. All expenses covered. His breath hitched, his vision blurred slightly. He flipped to the next page. Job offer. Senior administrative position at Crawford Enterprises for Ms. Carter. His mother gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Jamal turned to her, watching as tears welled in her eyes before she even managed to speak. "A job?" she whispered, voice barely steady. Lillian nodded, her expression warm. "Not just any job. A high-paying position. One that recognizes the strength and dedication you've already shown your whole life." Jamal swallowed hard, his chest tightening. He knew how hard his mother worked. The overnight shifts, the exhaustion in her bones, the sacrifices she made just to keep them afloat. And now, all of that was about to change. But the surprises weren't over. He turned to the next page, his eyes scanning the words. Relocation package, a new home in Kensington Hills. Jamal nearly dropped the papers. A home. Not this rundown apartment with the leaking ceilings and the broken heater. Not the neighborhood where they had to double-check the locks every night. A safe home. His little sister tugged on his pants, looking up at him. "Jamal, does this mean we don't have to struggle anymore?" His throat closed up. He couldn't even speak. His mother sobbed, covering her face with her hands. Jamal reached for her instinctively, wrapping his arms around her as she trembled against him. Lillian stepped closer, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. When he finally looked up at her, his eyes were full of raw disbelief. I don't know what to say," he admitted, voice shaking. Lillian smiled, her own eyes glistening. "Just promise me you'll keep being you." Jamal let out a shaky breath, a quiet, awed laugh escaping him. He looked around, at his mother, at his little sister, at the neighbors who had gathered to witness something none of them had ever expected to see. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel invisible. For the first time in his life, he didn't have to fight just to survive. And for the first time in his life, he allowed himself to believe that kindness truly did come full circle. The limo's engine purred softly as it pulled away from the curb, gliding smoothly down the rain-slicked streets. Jamal sat pressed against the window, watching his old neighborhood shrink into the distance, the familiar cracked sidewalks and rusted street signs fading away. He had walked these streets his whole life. He had memorized every pothole, every shortcut, every corner where he and his friends used to play, and now he was leaving it all behind. Beside him, his mother sat clutching the job contract in her lap, as if afraid that at any moment it might vanish like a dream. She wiped away silent tears, her fingers trembling over the words that promised stability, dignity, a future where she didn't have to work herself to exhaustion just to put food on the table. Across from them, his little sister bounced excitedly in her seat, eyes sparkling with wonder. "Jamal, my own room, can you believe it? I'm gonna paint the walls pink. No, blue. No, wait. Maybe glow-in-the-dark stars all over the ceiling." Jamal chuckled, shaking his head. "Do whatever you want, Maya. It's your space now." His voice was steady, but inside, his heart was hammering, because he still couldn't believe this was real. He glanced down at the thick envelope still clutched in his hands. The weight of it felt different now. Not just money, not just opportunity, but proof that the world could still surprise him. One night, one decision, one simple act of kindness, and everything had changed. He looked out the window one last time, taking in the sight of his old life disappearing behind him, the broken streetlights, the small corner store where he had borrowed a phone, the flickering glow of the diner where he had worked late nights just to make ends meet. A life full of struggle, a life full of uncertainty. But now, a new chapter was beginning. Jamal exhaled slowly, letting the tension seep from his shoulders. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't just surviving, he was moving forward,